Most organizations think customer experience is about delivering good service, hitting satisfaction targets, or fixing problems that show up. But that's not how people actually experience your organization. Customer experience lives in memory, what people remember when something feels hard, frustrating, effortless, or unexpectedly human. And those memories aren't shaped by averages. They're shaped by moments, emotions, and how the experience ends. In this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast, we take a behavioral science lens to the customer experience, why friction matters more than features, why effort often outweighs excellence, and why small details can quietly shape loyalty or drive defection. In this episode, I am joined by Jon Picoult, founder of Watermark Consulting and best-selling author of the book From Impressed to Obsessed. Jon advises executive teams on how to design end-to-end experiences that don't just satisfy customers, but intentionally shape what people remember. Together, we unpack real examples from Amazon, Apple, Alaska Airlines, IKEA, and many more, exploring ideas like rap rage, peaks and valleys, finishing strong, effortlessness, emotional design, and the simple truth that every role in an organization either serves a customer or serves someone else who does. Because the real advantage today isn't satisfaction, it's designing experiences people remember and choose again. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Through candid conversations and expert perspectives, we dive into the challenges, breakthroughs, and practical lessons that shape exceptional leadership. Welcome to the program, Jon.
Thanks, Charles. Good to be with you.
Good. I always like to start each conversation with our listeners learning more about you. So tell us more about yourself and how did you get your start in the business world and what made you want to launch a customer experience consultancy?
Uh, I got my start in the business world with door-to-door radio advertisement selling, which sounds like kind of a strange route, but it was actually back when I was in college, and I wanted to be a DJ on the college radio station. And it was actually a commercial station that was run by students, so it received no funding from the university. And so when I walked in and asked them if I could get a show, they said, well, sure, but if you want anything other than the graveyard shift, you need to sell ads for us. And so that's what I started doing. And I actually found that I was pretty good at it. And eventually even became the sales director of the station. And that was kind of my entree into business. But I would also say that was my entree into customer experience, even though I didn't know it at the time, because what I came to discover through that was how even the smallest details in your interactions with a sales prospect or a customer can really have an enormous influence on their likelihood to engage with you and to do business with you. So, for example, something just as simple as the formatting of our rate card. It used to look like this really old, ugly, postcard, and it was hard to interpret. And one of the first things I did was just revamp that so it was a little more visually appealing. And I actually found that that alone made a really big difference in people's likelihood to engage and consider advertising on the station. So that's where I kind of first got my entree into this idea of all of the different interactions that can shape customer perceptions and their willingness to do business with you. After I graduated, I went to business school and then worked in at Fortune 100 firms. Started off in rotational management training programs. Eventually, had the opportunity to lead everything from sales, service, marketing, distribution, operations, even IT. And I had always been interested in launching my own consultancy, and what I came to realize is having walked in the shoes of those different functional leaders throughout my career, I kinda had this unique perspective because where many companies go wrong with customer experience is they don't realize it, but their functional leaders are kinda working at cross purposes. They're focused on their particular objectives, their silo metrics, without regard for the more holistic customer experience. That's kinda when I said to myself, "Hey, I think I have a unique perspective here," and decided to put out my own shingle and launched Watermark back in 2009. So I guess we're in our 17th year now.
Love it. Thanks for that backstory. Let's start with the provocative opening line in your book, which says, aspiring to satisfy your customers, then you're aspiring to mediocrity. Now, this seems to contradict, Jon, a fundamental business tenet, which we're all familiar with.
To put it bluntly, Charles, I would say that customer satisfaction is a one-way ticket to the business graveyard. And the reason that I say that is because study after study has shown that satisfied customers defect all the time. They just leave. So if you want to derive competitive advantage, strategic advantage from the customer experience you deliver, it's not enough to merely satisfy your customers. You need to impress them. And I use that word very deliberately because this is ultimately a memory shaping exercise. You need to leave an impression on people that is going to drive their future repurchase and referral behavior. And the fact of the matter is that merely satisfying people doesn't create those kinds of impressions, those kinds of memories. To do that, you really need to create that indelible impression in their mind. And the book is, of course, all about the different techniques for accomplishing that.
Love that. And you're right. It's counterintuitive, but great insight there. Well, let's move into one of the stories that I love in the book, and that's around rap rage. And let me set a little bit of context to that. 1978, the inventor Thomas Jake Lunsford patented a new form of plastic packaging and unknowingly triggered the ire of hundreds of millions of consumers. His invention was that clamshell, the type of packaging that envelops a product. The public frustration was that they couldn't open it. What was Amazon's solution, and what are those important lessons that it teaches us about the customer experience?
So Amazon's solution, after getting letters and photographs from their customers that were illustrating all of these injuries that they received as they were trying to rip open this ridiculous packaging, they rolled out what they called frustration-free packaging. And basically what it meant is that wherever possible, they negotiated with their suppliers. So the suppliers would take the products out of, those annoying metal twist ties, out of the clamshell package. They'd give it to Amazon. Amazon puts it in their box. They ship it to you. You get it, you use it. There's no blood or tears, no lacerations. Everybody's a lot happier. And what what I think that the advent of frustration-free packaging really illustrates is three key things about customer experience. The first is that the customer experience is all-encompassing. It involves every live, print, and digital interaction point that your customers or your sales prospects could possibly stumble across when working with your business. And in the case of Amazon, what they realized is that people might get their package on time, but if they are enraged and frustrated because it's so hard to open the package that they got, then Amazon loses the game there. Like they lose an opportunity. That is a missed opportunity to further endear themselves to their customers. So even the design of the packaging, which many would argue was outside of Amazon's wheelhouse. Many would say once they ship it, that's it, it's done. But Amazon never saw it that way. So this idea that even the box that the product comes in is part of the customer experience, that's one key takeaway. The second key takeaway I would say is that what matters most in customer experience is the customer's perspective. The idea for some solution to rap rage, as I said, came from Amazon customers themselves. They were writing the company, talking about all the tools they had to use to rip open this ridiculous packaging. So listening to your customers, understanding not only what their pain points are, but what their hopes and aspirations are, the things that remove friction but also create delight, that's key to engineering a great customer experience. And then the third thing I would say that we learned from Amazon's Rap Rage solution is that customers' perspectives are shaped as much by feelings, if not more, than by their rational, logical evaluation of the encounter. It is not an accident that frustration free packaging is called frustration free packaging. It actually illuminates a key idea in customer experience, which is that the emotional resonance of the interaction is what's ultimately going to sway people and leave those indelible impressions that we talked about. So, I might get the package on time, but how did I feel when I opened it? Was I excited or was I exasperated? That's what Amazon was seeking to remedy with frustration free packaging. And the key learning for any company is you can't just focus on the logical, rational criteria for is the customer experience good or bad. You really want to think about how does it make your customer feel? Because that's what's really going to carry the day.
And that's what great salespeople do all the time. It's not leading with that rational, logical self, but getting them to feel the right emotion. And delivering that kind of end to end excellence requires every employee to see their connection to the customer's outcome in the simplest possible terms. You mentioned there's two roles in any organization. What are they?
Yeah, the two roles are simply this: you are either serving the customer or you are serving someone else who does. Period, full stop, End of story. And the reason I think that's a really important mantra for leaders to carry forward to their teams is there are a lot of people in every organization that don't have regular day to day contact with your end customer. And it's very possible for those people to sort of lose sight of the why behind what they do. I might work in a mailroom. So how does what I'm working on actually influence the customer? I might be creating writing code in an IT department. Yeah, I never interact with a customer. How do I influence the experience? So when you say to people, listen, you're either serving the customer or you're serving someone else who does, what it really does is it crystallizes that everybody has a customer in the organization, no matter what job you possess, no matter what title you hold. And you have to deliver a great, memorable experience to your customer, whether internal or external, in order for that individual to have any hope to deliver a great, memorable experience to the end customer. As I like to say, not everybody on your team might be customer facing, but they are most definitely customer impacting. And it's the job of every leader to really make that absolutely clear to everyone in the organization so that they understand whatever it is that they're doing, how it ultimately downstream impacts the customer experience and the customer themselves.
And framing every job through this lens really helps align decisions, remove handoffs that add friction, and focus teams on outcomes that the customers actually experience and remember. So, with the roles clarified, really the first design imperative is to engineer more peaks and fewer values. That's principle number one. Talk to us more about that and unpack this concept of the tentpole effect and what it reveals about how one strong moment can lift the entire experience.
So the peaks and valleys idea really relates to what is the cognitive science behind great customer experiences and how memories are formed. What the science has shown us is that people don't remember their experiences like a streaming video, like a continuous movie. It's not like we remember every frame in the encounter and then we tag each frame with is it unpleasant or is it pleasant? And then there's some algorithm in our head that calculates the proportion of pleasant frames versus unpleasant and decides whether or not we're happy. That is not how it works. Rather than remembering things as a streaming video, we remember our experiences as a series of snapshots. And it's not just any snapshots that we remember. The camera shutter clicks at very specific moments. It clicks on the peaks in the experience, the high points, it clicks on the values in the experience, the low points, and it also clicks on the last thing that happens to us in the interaction. And so peaks and valleys is about that, the snapshots that are clicking at those peaks and valleys. And the idea here is how do you create more and higher peaks and fewer and less deep valleys so that the snapshots that your customers and your sales prospects are taking away are in some going to be positive and going to leave them with a favorable impression. And one really important thing to underscore about this cognitive science, this psychology behind it is you can have an imperfect customer experience and still win in the marketplace. Because based on how you sculpt the experience and the associated memories, based on how you sequence the interactions, how you separate them, you can actually use psychology to create more and higher peaks, fewer and less deep valleys. And so, even though you might have parts of the experience that are just kind of mediocre, you could still actually leave people with a really wow impression based on how you're sequencing and creating those snapshots. Now, you mentioned the tentpole effect. That is one of these sort of psychological tricks around creating more and higher peaks. What the tentpole effects refers to is it's rooted in a psychology bias known as the halo effect. And imagine that you are lifting the center pole of a tent, like a circus tent, higher and higher. Think about what happens to the surface of the entire tent when you lift that pole. What happens? It sort of elevates all of it. It's almost like a tide that lifts all boats. That is actually how our memories of an interaction works. If there is one part of the encounter, call that the tent pole, that is a really high peak, people will actually feel better about every other part of the experience, even if you don't lift a finger to change those parts. And, in the book, I talk about one of my clients, Fortune 100 insurance company, where they did an analysis with their customer feedback, and they found that if their customer was really, really happy with their agent, their insurance agent, then they found that those folks were materially more happy with most everything else about the insurer: their website, their billing, their coverage parameters, their rates, all things that had nothing to do with the agent. But there was a great illustration of how if you do one thing really, really well, people are going to feel better about everything else that goes on in the experience.
Well, and by creating at least one of those outstanding moments, like you mentioned, and minimizing those low points, the overall recollection skews positive because people remember, like you said, the peaks and the endings more than the average of the moments. So
Yes.
great insight there. So that emphasis on memory sets up the next principle of why finishing strong can outweigh everything that came before it. Talk to me about that principle. And I love the story about the 25-minute baggage guarantee and why Alaska Airlines did that and what impact it had on their ratings.
We talked about the halo bias with peaks and valleys. With finish strong, that's grounded in a psychology tenet known as the recency bias. And what the recency bias tells us is that the last thing that happens to us in an encounter exerts a disproportionate influence over our perception and memories of that experience. So the takeaway is you want to finish strong. First impressions are important, but final impressions are even more meaningful. This is why a lawyer's closing argument to a jury is so important. This is why a fireworks display ends with an awe inspiring finale. It's why mediocre comedies tack a funny blooper reel onto the end of the film. It's why a decadent dessert is served at the end of a meal. These are all examples of interactions that are carefully sculpted to manipulate people's overall impressions by exploiting the end point of the experience. And so the 25-minute baggage guarantee was something that was introduced by Alaska Airlines in 2009. And the way it worked was because let's step back for a moment. What they realized is something that many airlines just don't fathom, which is that the end point of the travel journey is picking up your bags at the baggage carousel. So, I could be on board and you could have the best onboard entertainment system around. You could have the most courteous flight attendants. But if I walk down to the baggage carousel after landing and I have to wait 40, 45 minutes for my bags to come out, game over. That's what I'm going to remember about the experience. So, what Alaska said is, let's overperform on that final touch point. And the 25-minute baggage guarantee basically said that when the plane connects to the jet bridge, that's when the clock starts. And within 25 minutes, if your bags are not rolling off the carousel, then Alaska is going to give you your choice of either $25 flight credit for future travel or 2,500 frequent flyer miles deposited in your loyalty account. And interestingly, the year after they rolled this out, they went on an unprecedented 12-year streak of winning J.D. Power's award for the best North American airline for customer satisfaction. Now, was it just because of the baggage guarantee? No, they were doing a lot of things right. But what I would argue is that their engineering of that final touch point helped to solidify positive memories for their customers. And oh, by the way, they eventually made it a 20-minute baggage guarantee because they actually improved their performance there. But so when JD Power calls up or surveys people and says, "Hey, what did you think of Alaska Airlines?" The memory that's going to come to their mind is, "Oh yeah, that baggage guarantee, my bags came out so quickly." And so that's how they're playing the game, and they're finishing strong, and by doing that, they are ending on this high note, and that exerts a disproportionate influence over people's perceptions and memories of the whole encounter.
So, if I got it right, then first, manufacture highs by parceling out good news and creating echoes that reinforce positive moments. Compress those unavoidable negatives into fewer, shorter interactions to prevent multiple valleys from dominating the memory, and then make sure you finish strong.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. And I think also it's an important point. Many people might be saying, "Oh, gee, wonderful. John's telling us to create more peaks, fewer valleys. So do more stuff well and less stuff poorly." And that is true. That is one way to do it. But as you noted, there are psychological techniques that you can use to compress the pain, to spread the pleasure in an experience, so that even with the experience you're currently delivering, there are ways to sequence it so that you create more and higher peaks, fewer and less deep valleys. And so there really is psychology behind this.
It's common sense, not necessarily common practice, and there's levers that you can pull on, which we're going to cover in throughout the conversation today. So, let's move from beyond this now into the next lever, and that's really effort. And many companies try to do this. Some, I would argue, don't do it that well, but removing that friction so doing business with them feels more automatic and easier. And Apple did this brilliantly on the connection between iTunes and the iPod that demonstrated this principle of effortlessness. First, unpack the principle and then perhaps go into this example and showcase really how they made it so easy to use their new technology.
Yeah. So by customer effort, what I'm referring to there is the time and energy that people need to invest in order to accomplish something with your business. And the sad fact is, we all know this as consumers, it's pretty rare that you come across a company that is consistently effortless to work with. Not just easy, but I mean absolutely effortless. And because that is so rare, when it does happen, it has the potential to create one of those peaks that people remember. And so that's the importance of making the interactions effortless. And because the bar is so low, it's really a way to differentiate yourself. So to go to the Apple example, this was back in early 2002 when Apple was considering entering the music file sharing business. And for anyone who was around and, playing music back in those days, you might remember that there were MP3 players that were out there, which is what the iPod, of course, is. And there were music file sharing services. And actually, many of them allowed you to download music for free. The most popular one was Napster. Now, obviously there was some legal wrangling that was going on with the music companies around that, but it hadn't been settled. I mean, at that point in time, you could actually download songs for free onto your MP3 device. But here's the catch. It actually turned out that it was very difficult for people to do that. It was the Wild West back then. And so if you had your MP3 player and you went to Napster, for example, and you searched a song, the way it worked is you would get back a list of results like a mile long of every personal server where that song was appearing. And so you would then have to roll the dice to pick the one that, was hopefully properly encoded so that when you downloaded it, it worked. And oftentimes a key frustration people had was they would download these files, then they would put them on their MP3 player and they would find like the last 10 seconds were cut off or it wasn't encoded correctly. And so the file didn't even play at all. And so what Steve Jobs and the folks at Apple said was, we can do better here. Apple's famous for not only managing the hardware side of things, but the software side of things. And because they manage both of those pieces, they're able to make them seamless. And that's what they did with music file sharing and downloading and playing on MP3 players. That was really the key to iPod and iTunes. They created such a seamless interface between those two things that it was effortless now for people to download songs and to play them on their iPod. But the kicker here, and what really underscores the power of effortless, is that once they introduced iTunes, the iPod just took off. As a matter of fact, Guy Kawasaki, who was the chief evangelist of Apple, I know you've had him as a guest on your program, he once said the genius of the iPod was iTunes, not iPod, because it was only when iTunes came out and that, seamless interaction was set up that the iPod took off. And what everybody really needs to understand here is people chose to use the Apple solution where you had to pay 99 cents per song, even though there were free alternatives available. And that is what underscores the power of an effortless experience, is that the most precious thing that we all have is our time. So that's the ultimate finite resource in our lives. And so if you come across a product that gives you the gift of time and convenience, as Apple, iPod, and iTunes did, you're willing to use that even if there are free alternatives. That's the amazing thing. And that was the great story about Apple and how they succeeded in that business.
I love that story. And reducing effort often means simplifying choices as well, which leads to the paradox of choice and how to design around it. So, talk to us about the paradox of choice and how did a jam experiment demonstrate this? Which I love this experiment. I've talked about it a lot on the program, but love for you to unpack it for our listeners.
Yeah, so the keep it simple principle is think about it's like effortless, but instead of relating to physical effort, how many times I have to retell my story to a service rep or how hard it is to open up a clamshell package, instead of it focused on the physical side, it's focused on the mental piece, the mental exertion, the cognitive effort that's involved in interpreting a product, understanding what it does, maybe assembling it, configuring it, or even just choosing it from the beginning. And that gets to this idea of the paradox of choice. The paradox of choice is a term that was coined by a professor by the name of Barry Schwartz. And basically, what it means is that more choice is not necessarily better. More choice is just more. And sometimes that could actually be worse because the way our brains are wired, if we encounter a high degree of cognitive effort in an experience, which is something that having many choices to have to select from can do, the way our brain is wired, we just shut down. We just kind of get paralyzed. Our brain tells us, walk away. This is just too difficult to think about. And when you're trying to engage a new sales prospect or an existing customer, that's of course the last reaction that you want to elicit. So, one way to mitigate the paradox of choice, of course, is to narrow the number of choices. And this was beautifully illustrated by a study that she was a Stanford University grad student at the time, a woman by the name of Sheena Iyengar. And what she did is she went to this local grocery store out in California and she set up a table for people to buy jam. On some days, she would put out 6 flavors of jam, and on other days, she would put out 24 flavors of jam. And so what she found is that when there were 24 flavors out, more people came to the table to browse, but fewer people bought. When she had only 6 flavors instead of 24, she found people were 6 times as likely to actually buy a jar of jam. And what the study really illustrates is how when you have too much choice and it creates that paralysis, you're actually sabotaging the success of your business. That if you winnow, the number of choices that are available to people, that actually is going to make it easier for them cognitively to select between those, and it's more likely that they're actually going to do business with you. So the idea of mitigating decision complexity is a really important piece of this cognitive puzzle. And even when you get it down to say a manageable number, another way that you can further mitigate the complexity is by giving people help me choose functionality. You see this on websites where, I mean, granted, you don't want 24 choices, but let's say you get it down to half a dozen. You could still make it easier and simpler for people by creating maybe a set of questions where you ask them what's important to them, and then you actually narrow the list even further based on the criteria they've shared with you. Websites where you're searching for any kind of product and they let you kind of check a few boxes to indicate what you're looking for, and it narrows the choices accordingly. That's a great example of mitigating the paradox of choice.
Well, and you're right. People don't crave unlimited choices. They want that perception of choice with guidance to a good decision, which is why curating assortments outperforms sprawling catalogs that we used to see so frequently. And I love some of your ideas that you gave. Limit options, start with an easy or a binary decision, chunk information into digestible steps so comprehension builds and anxiety falls, which increases conversion and post choice satisfaction as well. Well, now we took care of the cognitive piece. Let's talk more about the heart. And really we touched upon this earlier about emotion because emotion often drives memory and choice. Talk to me about how to stir emotion and why Amazon, not Apple, Disney, or Nike, held the top ranking for emotional appeal for 7 straight years.
A great way to introduce this concept is actually to share a quote from the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt. He once said, "The emotional tail wags the rational dog." And he wasn't talking specifically about customer experience, but it absolutely applies to customer experience. Because as we've talked about before, people's perceptions and memories of the interactions they have are largely going to be influenced by the emotional resonance of the encounter rather than the logical, rational piece. And indeed, when an experience is laced with emotion, it really can help amplify those peaks or potentially those valleys as well. And so that's why the emotional piece is so important. Now, what's critical for listeners to understand is many people think emotion and they think, oh, so I need to make my customers happy, right? I need to accentuate positive emotions with them. And that is not entirely accurate. And that's really where the nuance comes around how you can accomplish this. Because there are people that are in businesses, if you're going to Disney World, you're like, yeah, easy for them to make you happy. But what if you're working with a financial advisor or an insurance agent? I mean, that's not a business where people get thrilled to go visit their insurance agent. But there are ways for even people in those professions to stir favorable emotion that makes the encounter more memorable. And that's what the Amazon study that you were referring to really illustrates. This was something, it was a piece of research that was done by a company called Harris Interactive, a big consumer polling group. And they ran a study where each year they created a reputation index for companies in the US. They went out to consumers, asked them a bunch of questions, and used the results to rank hundreds of companies in the US by the quality of their reputation. And one of the questions that they asked consumers was, what company out there has the greatest emotional appeal for you? And for 7 straight years, one company came in first place, and it was a streak that was only broken by Harris Interactive stopping the reputation index. And that company, as you know, was Amazon. And it is kind of shocking that they did that because think about it. Amazon is a company that sells other people's products. They have virtually no retail storefront presence. How does a company like that achieve the number one ranking in emotional appeal for 7 years running? Over firms like Disney or Nike that seem more intuitively emotional. And the answer is that they hit it from two angles. When you click that one click purchase button on Amazon and you get your confirm email back, and it says, hey, congratulations, here's what you bought, here's when it's going to ship from our warehouse, here's when it's going to get at your front door. When people get that email, what they tend to feel is peace of mind, especially if they've used Amazon before, because Amazon's reliable, they know they're all set. And so, in essence, Amazon is accentuating positive emotion there, this notion of peace of mind. But there's something else that's going through people's heads, even if subconsciously, when they get that confirm. And it's something along the lines of this: gee, I'm glad I didn't need to go and fight the crowds at the mall to go pick up this product. Or, wow, I'm glad I didn't need to circle some busy city street to find a parking spot so I could run into a store to get this. Instead, Amazon's just going to deliver it right to my doorstep. So what you find is that Amazon isn't just accentuating positive emotion in the case of peace of mind, they're also mitigating negative emotion, in this case around hassle and inconvenience. And that is why in totality, they stir such favorable, memorable emotion in people's minds, as indicated by that Harris Interactive study. So these are the two pieces that every business needs to think about. You have to think about, how do I accentuate positive emotions for my sales prospects and customers? But also, how do I mitigate negative ones? There are a lot of businesses where customers and prospects come to you and they are harboring negative emotions. They might be stressed about something they're about to do. They might be fearful that they don't understand what it is that they're going to be going through and tough decisions they might need to make. If you engineer your experience in a way that takes some of those negative emotions off the table, you will in totality be stirring that compelling emotion that will help really sear the memory of the interaction in people's heads in a favorable way.
That's great. Hitting it from both angles, because you're right. Many organizations just tackle the positive experience, don't really look at the negative and trying to minimize those valleys as much as possible.
Yeah.
But one powerful way to influence those feelings is by restoring a sense of control, which is the next principle, even in surprisingly small choices. Talk to us about this perception of control, how it lowers anxiety and even physical discomfort. And you give a great experiment here that was done with just which arm you choose to have blood drawn from can improve the overall experience, which I find fascinating.
That's one of my favorite studies in the book. But so the perception of control, just to explain that, we as human beings, we like to be in control of things. We like to have what is known as direct behavioral control, our hands on the steering wheel driving. The problem is, in many businesses, you can't give your customers direct behavioral control. Going back to my earlier example, the insurance agent, I can't underwrite insurance for myself. I have to delegate that to a third party. But the point is, in any business, when you delegate any activity to that business or to any third party, immediately the experience will feel less good to your customer, because what they will see it as is it's a loss of control. And because we like this idea of control, the minute we feel like we've lost it, any experience that we go through is not going to feel as good as a result. Now, what's interesting, because a lot of research has been done on this, is it's been found that there's a really good proxy for giving people direct behavioral control, and that is giving them the perception, the sense that they have control. And if you do that, people will actually feel better about whatever experience they're going through with you, even if you don't lift a finger to improve the underlying mechanics of the experience. I mean, it is magical how this works, which is why I really love this principle. And to illustrate that magic, let's talk about the study that you mentioned. Again, one of my favorites from the book. So this was done by a USC psychology student, a gentleman by the name of Richard Mills. and he partnered with the local Red Cross blood donation center. And basically, he divided blood donors into two groups. And with one group, when they sat down, the nurse, the phlebotomist, before they took the blood donation, they just asked the donor, which is your non-dominant arm? And that's what they took the blood from. But with the second group, what the nurses did is they actually asked the donor, which arm would you like me to draw blood from? So at the end of the day, Richard Mills interviewed all of the blood donors. And what he found was that the folks who were given the choice of arm to draw blood from, they actually said on average that they felt less pain through the procedure and they had a better experience donating blood. And what's amazing is the only difference between the two groups was with that group, they were given the choice of which arm to draw blood from, which you could argue is a really meaningless choice, right? Left arm or right arm, it is still a stranger coming at you with a sharp needle. But what it does is it gives people a sense of control. It gives people a sense of agency. If I can just tell the nurse I want right arm over left arm, suddenly I feel like I am exerting some control over what's going on around me. And that alone makes me feel better about the entire experience. And so, this is something that can be employed in any business. And oftentimes it doesn't cost a lot of money. Something just as simple as setting expectations with people, about how long a wait is it going to be. That alone makes a big difference because unknown waits feel worse to people than known waits, because an unknown wait is a loss of control. I'm standing there in line. I have no idea how long I'm going to be here for. Completely robs me of control and undermines the quality of the whole experience. So it's a really powerful principle and one that can be employed in very cost-effective ways.
And like you stated, you can even give control in very small ways. Set specific expectations, status updates, showing progress, offering options like delivery windows or communication channels, which confer control without changing the actual speed, but they improve the overall customer experience as a result. I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review. As we close with this conversation, it's worth stepping back to the real takeaway from this episode. Customer experience isn't something you add on. It's something you design, whether intentionally or by default. Every interaction creates a memory. Every friction point creates emotion, and every ending leaves an imprint. And what customers remember is rarely the average of what happened. They remember the peaks, the frustrations, the moments of effort or ease, and how the experience made them feel when it mattered most. The leaders who win aren't the ones chasing satisfaction metrics. They're the ones eliminating friction, restoring control, and engineering moments that people want to return to. So here's the challenge to carry with you. Look at one end-to-end experience your customers or employees go through. Remove one unnecessary valley. Create one intentional peak. And make sure to finish stronger than it starts. Because in the end, loyalty isn't built by what you intend to deliver. It's built by what people remember. Thanks for listening to the Good Leadership Podcast.